Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our podcast. We are here today to talk to you about Pinocchio, which is our third episode. It's the second movie produced by Disney. And I'm excited for this conversation because I think that there's a lot of sticky metaphors in here, and we're going to talk about that today. Ben, I would love for you to start us off by just giving us kind of a synopsis of the Disney version of the telling of Pinocchio.
Totally, because there are a couple of different versions. There's a book as well, and so in the Disney version, it's kind of, I think, simplified a little bit, and it's the story of a little wooden boy. For those of you who have not seen Pinocchio or who have forgotten, the story of a little wooden boy gets brought to life by the magic blue fairy, and he's set on a quest to prove his bravery, his trustworthiness, and his unselfishness. And if he can do that, he can become a real boy. And so he sets off on a journey. First, he gets kind of hoodwinked on his way to school and swept into the actor's life and taken advantage of by some Stromboli, the puppeteer, by a very dark guy. And then the two, I forget what they're called, but it's the fox and the weasel who are hoodwinking him into these things. They're like the voices of temptation. Oh, it's a cat. It's a fox and a cat. Yeah,
fox and a cat.
Makes sense. Yeah, and then after being rescued by the blue fairy from his plight, she says, "Never again. I'm not going to rescue you again." And then, sure enough, he gets swept up in another scheme from Handsome John and his friend the cat, and he. Is it Handsome John? I feel like his name actually has the characteristic to be on the lookout for from him. But anyway, he gets swept into Pleasure Island, invited to Pleasure Island, where you can do whatever you want. You can smoke and drink, and all these other boys are there. And then he finds out over the course of time that these boys are turning into jackasses and then being sold into slavery for their labor as their jackasses. And so he, yet again, survives from that. But he didn't fully turn. So he kind of maintained some of his moral character there, I think. And we'll talk more about that. But he didn't fully turn into a donkey. He just started to turn into a donkey, which actually then gave him some – we'll talk more about that too. But he needed that tail to get to the – so then he goes home, finds out that Geppetto's been taken. He only wanted to get back to his father as a loving, devoted son. And finds out that Geppetto has been looking for him for months. He's lost, and then turns out he thinks that Monstro the whale may have been involved, and so he was swallowed by Monstro the whale. And so then Pinocchio has to go brave the sea, and then he gets swallowed by the whale, and then they figure out a way to get out, and then he has proven that he has bravery, trustworthiness, and unselfishness, and gains his full personhood. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the Disney version.
Awesome.
Tell me about the book, yeah.
So some of the kind of differences, one of the biggest differences is the character in the Disney movie is quite endearing. He's a little naive and sweet. Carlo Collodi's telling of him is he's mischievous, he's a ragamuffin and a good for nothing, and he is very mischievous, and he even
like a troublemaker,
a troublemaker, kind of disregard for other people. There's this interesting tension in the book between his kind of disregard and kind of desire to just pursue his own kind of interests, and at the kind of downfall of the people in his world, like the Blue Fairy and his father, right? And so in the book, he's kind of bad. And Carlo Collodi's, from what I understand, his intention was as a warning to other people. If you don't care about, if you kind of disregard the people in your world, kind of how that can have an impact on them. He's even violent. So in one of the things that you didn't talk about was the conscience.
Jiminy Cricket. Yeah.
Jiminy Cricket, right? And so in the book, the cricket has a role. It's not as significant as in the Disney movie, but he kills the cricket
right away,
a couple chapters in, and I was
yeah.
Yeah, he's just the cricket comes along and is hey, maybe don't be so bad, and Pinocchio just kills the cricket.
How
and then
dare
I was
you?
How dare you? The cricket makes he comes back to life and makes a reappearance later on the book, but that was another key difference.
Cool. So let's step into talking about some of the metaphors in this story and kind of like what it might represent for us. Anything else to add?
Totally. Something I want to add before we jump into the metaphors is I want to just touch on the cultural context. So we're talking about a book that was written in the 1800s, and the context at the time was the Industrial Revolution was happening. And so in this time, we had all of these peasants that were living out in the country coming into the cities and not having the kind of cultural awareness on how things are done. And so kind of the role of the cat and the fox in the story of Pinocchio is like, if you come into the city as a peasant in 1800s Italy, people could take advantage of you. Like, they rob him. They actually, the cat and fox hang Pinocchio in the book, but he's like a wooden puppet, so he doesn't die, but he gets rescued by the Blue Fairy. Another really interesting thing that I just learned as I was preparing for this conversation is that Pinocchio is the third most translated book in the world.
Whoa.
After the Bible and The Little Prince.
Okay, that is fascinating. Because
isn't it just so fascinating?
Because remember, we're looking at these stories because of how they resonate with the world. And so, the Bible is obviously highly resonant. Sounds like The Little Prince is highly resonant. Great story. Maybe we'll talk about that someday. But then Pinocchio, huh? Interesting.
Yeah. And what is also interesting to me about this is I found myself reading the book and watching the movie of Pinocchio. And comparatively, when we watched Snow White was quite a compelling tale. And I found myself leaning in, and we were watching Pinocchio, and I remember at one point, both you and I had picked up our phones and weren't paying attention.
we were bored. we were bored. Although, to be fair, we did watch Pinocchio last year with your mom, remember? So I was pretty aware of the story, and we were reviewing it for the podcast. So, and it's just not as compelling of a story as a Snow White. I think there's less of a clear story arc to what's happening with Pinocchio. It's more like these vignettes that happen where he's at Stromboli's and he's at Pleasure Island and then he's at the whale. And the through line there isn't that compelling. And also, Pinocchio as a character isn't really that compelling in the... And I think that's part of the nature of this story, right? Because it is a coming-of-age story in some way. Pinocchio is on a quest to become a quote-unquote real boy. And we might say to become a real human, right? To be worthy of, being a real... Because a real boy can then become a real man, right? And so Pinocchio is on this journey to cultivate these characteristics, and I think it's really a moral tale, right? Of what can happen if you don't follow these things, and then what happens if you do. So he's off to become brave, trustworthy, and unselfish. Now we might have a conversation about are those the characteristics that we want to really but for the sake of the story, sure, these are values that we'd see being present in people, and then it's almost like each vignette is there to prove that he has one of those characteristics, right? Because he gets swept up in he's supposed to go to school. He said, "I'm going to school," and then he gets swept up in the puppet show, right? And so that's trustworthiness. He didn't have trustworthiness, so he got swept up, right? He wasn't worthy of being a boy, and then he got into his next problem where they all got sent to Pleasure Island, where you get to be as selfish as you want to be, right? And so he wasn't unselfish. And he became an ass, and he had his vignette happen there. So each one of these vignettes is a place for him to learn something, and then he has to obviously go down and brave the depths in the belly of the whale, and that is bravery. He's showing bravery there too. So he's out to pick up these qualities and characteristics, and that's kind of what his journey is about. So I think that's part of why the story is a little bit less compelling. There's a very clear villain and a very clear, in Snow White, there's a very clear villain and a very clear objective. She's trying to stay alive, basically, right? And with Pinocchio, it's something a little bit more. He's trying to become a person worthy of citizenship, you might say, or worthy of inclusion in humanity. Because again, I believe that these stories are resonating because they're clues to teach us what survives, right? And in a way, the Blue Fairy, I think, could be said to represent the social contract that helps to keep everybody healthy and safe and the story flowing, right? If everybody shows up as brave, trustworthy, and unselfish, well, we'll get along as humans, and we'll probably be able to survive for a really long time, right? If everybody shows up as timid, I guess, untrustworthy, and selfish, well, then the social construct breaks down, and we're probably not that set up for surviving. Yeah?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Something that I think is really interesting also is we watched this book and we watched the movie, and there's this kind of, it's almost like it's an argument for conformity. Like, here's how you be boy. Here's how you do it, like, right or correctly. And then shortly after we watched Pinocchio, we watched Turning Red, which is a completely almost opposing narrative of how do you be, like, free from the expectations of the people in your world and the expectations they've put on you, and be like a free, independent identity, which is totally different. And I get curious about that because it seems like that kind of, it would be interesting to know, like, in the future, how sticky, like, how can the story of Turning Red transcend time? Like, would it stick? But it seems like it's a representation of kind of our cultural psychology as a humanity, of this kind of going from the Industrial Revolution, where there's these very different cultures really closely geographically located, and when they merge, there's problems. The peasants get taken advantage of. The city folk are like, why don't you just conform? Like, we have a way of doing things here. Versus today, where we have cultural differences, but we have a lot more awareness because we have so much connection to each other and ability to, like, research and understand how different cultures are different. And so it seems like maybe it's not as problematic. And with that in place, maybe there's some sort of a, like, cultural safety that comes into play that allows for something like the narrative of Turning Red, for people to really come into their own individual identity. What do you think about that?
It's an interesting thought, because I'm actually wondering if it has even this other aspect to it that we haven't discussed, which is the cultural sort of societal norms in the various different cultures. Because, like, Pinocchio it was born out of Italy, so it's like Western culture, right? But Turning Red, that is kind of illustrating and showing a more Asian culture, like the traditional Asian values, which are very community centered. So, like, in the West, we're very, like, individualist, right? And then in the East, they tend to be more communally, culturally. Family is very important. Your society is very important. Honor is very important. Those kinds of things. And so I think that it's almost like they're addressing different tensions. In the West, where, look, all Pinocchio's challenges he gets into trouble because he's acting selfishly. Right? And he's naive. And so those are, like, his two kind of tragic flaws. But in Turning Red, she's kind of trying to separate herself out from and handle the tension that is, like, desiring to be, and also it's based in the West too. So she's got this, like, social culture that she lives in, and then her family culture that she comes from, and kind of the tension that's happening there is really driving the story. Like, she's always, like, quote unquote disobeying her mom or her grandmother or whatever in that story. Whereas Pinocchio, the moral of the story is, like, be unselfish, do more of that, be more devoted to your father, right? Because he's not. That's part of what gets him into trouble. Is his dad says go to school, which, look, by the way, Geppetto does not prepare him for the world at all. He's just like, it's your first day being alive. Go here's your books, right? Like, have fun. And Pinocchio's like, okay, and he has no idea. And so I think that there's also that cultural context, but. And this is the really cool thing that you see again and again in myth and metaphor, is this tension between the individual and the society, right? Because what is good for the individual is not always good for the society, right? And so we have this tension that exists. Like, you see it in Little Mermaid. It's a really big thing that happens because King Trident, he, like, represents the society that you might call the patriarchy, but, like, definitely the king, like the monarchy. There is a rule of law, and it exists to keep us safe. But then there's Ariel, who she wants to be free and wants to sing. She's a fish, for God's sake. And so there's this tension between what society says and what the individual wants, which that is, again, a model because again, all of these things are just talking about our psychology and what resonates with us as people. But if you look, that's essentially what it means to come of age, to be a person, right? You're born, babies are perfectly selfish. They have zero concern or interest or maybe even awareness of any other individuals, right? And it's only through a process of growth and development that we become aware of other people, right?
Can I push back on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just like considering from like an attachment theory perspective, that babies actually do have an awareness of their parents because they're looking to them to help them understand what's safe.
Well, they do once they get to a certain point. I'm talking about like a baby who's just born has zero awareness.
Like an infant.
Yeah, and it's over time that we develop any sense of self. That's what's happening as we're growing, is we're developing our sense of self, our sense of awareness of other things. In the beginning, I don't think there's any awareness at all. I don't even think the eyes are actually working that well. Certainly not imagine what it would be like to interpret sense data with no context at all. Like everything's just a chaotic mess, right? We are just self crying in the wind, so to speak. And so the tension that exists is like that of like a wild animal being encultured, right? Like a beast comes into the world who's perfectly selfish, has no, like, I'm not saying, I don't have a bad story about selfish, you know what I mean? What I'm saying is they come in and they're perfectly selfish, self-centered. Self-interested. They don't even have any other data points really. And then it's through the process of growth and development. And that's what raising a child is saying like, hey, there are certain ways that at its highest and best, I think there are certain ways that if you act these ways, you're more likely to succeed in society. You're more likely to get what you want, to be able to navigate the world in an effective way, right? And so what we're doing is like, and a big part of that is like curb your selfishness, right? Don't hit other people and take what they have, because if you do that, you're going to have a hard time making friends. And it's a lot easier, this thing, if you make friends, right?
So in the book, what happens is like, so Geppetto sends Pinocchio to school. He like sends him out the door with books, right? In the movie. In the book, he wants the best for Pinocchio, and in a really selfless state, he sells his only coat, right? Like it's his only coat. He sells it so that Pinocchio can have books. And Pinocchio is like on his way to school and then gets compelled to sell the books for a fraction of the price and like take these coins and go to the puppet show, essentially. And so it's like this story of kind of just to illustrate when you take an action, like basically he takes Geppetto's power away to, like care for him and give him a good life by kind of disregarding the, I guess like the love behind Geppetto's action of selling his only coat. Because now he's cold, right? Selling his only coat so that Pinocchio can go to school. Like that kind of selfishness being illustrated, I think is really powerful. And in the book, it makes Pinocchio like a really like character where you're just like, gosh, man, get it together. Like that's so disrespectful and rude.
Yeah. And so look, the character in the book, it sounds like is a little bit less portrayed as naive and more like mischievous. And also we're talking about a young person learning to navigate the world literally for the first time, because whether it's in the book and he's got this mischievous characteristic or it's in the movie and he's completely naive, it literally is his first day on the planet, you know what I mean? So his naivety is there. He doesn't know how the world works, and that's why he's being taken advantage of, and that's how it also maps back to the symbols for peasants or whatever. So he just doesn't know how things work, right? And so part of what it means to grow up, and if Pinocchio is our hero, right, he's there to teach us qualities, the heroic qualities in the world, right? And so in order to do that, he has to learn those heroic qualities because it's a coming of age story. He doesn't start off a hero. He becomes one by the end of the story, hopefully, if he's developed these characteristics. And so he's got a map to follow, and he's trying to learn those things. And so it's like, and I love that you bring this thing up, because it's like Geppetto sells his coat, but Pinocchio has no context for what that means. He doesn't.
Right. Yeah.
He doesn't understand. First of all, he's wooden, so he doesn't understand cold, right? So he doesn't even understand what it means to have a coat. And then he's taken advantage of because he just doesn't understand the way that the world works. Look, he gets taken advantage of by merchants, because merchants are selling the coat for less than it's worth for the books, and then he's selling the books for less than they're worth to get the coins, right? And it's all this cycle that's happening, and that's because of his naivety. He doesn't know. He's young, and I want to give him some credit, even though he's a mischievous, troublemaker, right? He doesn't know, and I think that's part of what the journey is about, is like coming to an awareness. Right. And does he have in the book this, because they probably made it nice and clean in the Disney movie, but does he have these characteristics that he's on a journey to get? The bravery, the unselfishness, and the trustworthiness? Yeah,
I think there is. It comes later in the book. It's not like it's not as clear from the outset, just because it was published as like a periodical, right? So,
but they are mentioned, or
yeah, it's later. It's later in the book. Yeah,
okay.
Ultimately, like the path to becoming a real boy. I was just like halfway through.
It was morbid curiosity if they included that, or if Disney kind of like doctored it up a little bit. But it's interesting that he. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think that the story is a little more cohesive and has like a clearer objective that he's overcoming in the Disney version than
they make it nice and neat, and package it up.
But I have so the core thing, as we're talking about this, that I keep coming back to for me is this kind of the tension that I feel between Pinocchio and there being some kind of like criteria that he is on a path to like achieving, and the tension between that, like this, the way that I feel about, like the way that I think about it is like these supposed tos and like these shoulds and like society says, which also with my clients and the coaching that I do is also like that's a really problematic component of people's development of like, well, everybody says that like you have to invest and you have to do this and you have to have health insurance, and there's all of these like criteria for what it means to like be a human that's worthy and fits in and does it right. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on how to kind of reconcile those two things, like Pinocchio needing to like become to this conformity and this pressure that sometimes people feel around conformity, and conformity being problematic for them.
Yeah. So I think that there's like a slight distinction to be made, because what those societal pressures to do certain things, that is a different quality than a societal pressure to embody certain characteristics or qualities, right? And so the difference being that these, and again, the story is like I think the reason myth is so interesting to study is because it's giving us clues into what survives, right? And into what kinds of things, into how to be a person who survives. Heroes are on a journey for immortality, right? That's what we're doing. And so what the blue fairy is giving him a path to is not societal conformity, but to individuation, in fact. How to be a hero in the world. How to be someone who is a part of the immortality process, right? You be brave. You be unselfish. You do things for other people, not for yourself. And you be trustworthy. You do what you say you're going to do. Right? And so these are like the heroic ethics that he's being invited to. That's different than make money.
Can we double tap on the...
Go ahead.
Yeah, can we just double tap on the selfish one? Like the selfless... Because I think that we have, in our contemporary society, there's like this kind of being self-interested or self-centered has kind of a negative connotation. Yeah. And the story of Pinocchio is kind of advocating for selflessness. And at some point, there's so much selflessness that they're like, how do you then be your own person and act in alignment with yourself, taking yourself into consideration before other people? And then, which is, like the path to living a life of kind of dissatisfaction because there's all these forces around you and it feels like you have to do things that maybe you don't really want to.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic, because I know it's something that comes up for us regularly in coaching, is this tension between what we want and what we're supposed to want or whatever. And I guess what I can say is that in myth, the purpose is survivability. It's immortality. I think that's just like what these myths are for, is to give us clues into what the path for, like, because you take they're like the guideposts. They're like the lesson plans for how we keep society going. Okay, so like imagine, people are like sitting around a fire and they're like passing on these stories. Like, we've found that when we do these things, like, we're able to survive longer. Okay, and so you have this tension where, because when we're coaching people, we're helping them like be themselves and be expressed in the world as well as they want. And that, I think that we're all on our own heroic journey in that way, but also like just realize that these fairy tales, I think the reason they stick around is because they give us clues. So you like take any 100 people and they say like, who's the best person of us? Like, what qualities does that person have? Right? And how do we model those qualities as, ideals? Like, this is the hero of our village, right? And then you take, 100 of those heroes together, right? And they say, okay, cool. Well, who's the best of those heroes? Right? Well, what qualities do they have? And now we have like the makings of a god. Okay? And then you take like 100 of those gods, right? And you say, all right, who's the best amongst the gods? And what qualities do they have abstractly, right? And now we have like a monotheistic culture. And this is the path that, by the way, these things took in our history, right? We first had the person who could have most of what they wanted in the village, right? And then we had like a bunch of villages getting together and they had their collections of their best versions of people, right? And this is where like God, the idea of gods came from. And then there's like this idea of like one God that embodies all the characteristics, right? The best characteristics, right? And so I think that these stories, what they're doing is they're like kind of, because if we embody bravery, trustworthiness, and unselfishness, well, society is much more likely to keep going, right? Because really, we are in a fight with chaos. It's order versus chaos, right? It's life versus death. And we don't, in our modern era, we're not always so aware of this dichotomy that's happening, because it's so easy to survive in our modern era for most people, right?
That's
Whereas
true.
for a long time in our human history, it was not so easy to survive, either for individuals or for groups of individuals to survive.
Yeah. I guess even in the context that Pinocchio was written in the 1800s, even
so
in that time period, being a peasant and coming into the city and not having like the same culture or moral fiber I guess the book in and of itself is kind of a discussion on like if moral fiber doesn't exist, like what the breakdown looks like. But even during that time period, it was quite dangerous, actually. Like, you could die a lot more likely than you could die today. As we're coming to the end of our time, what do you think are some good, like, kind of closing thoughts here?
Yeah. Well, I do just want to add one more thing to this distinction, because I'm becoming aware of a distinction, and I've been playing with this for a little while, I think. But selfishness versus self-centeredness. So, like, just to give a different flavor to these two terms, because I think what we're advocating here, because you can see what he's doing in Pleasure Island, where he's overcoming selfishness, is he's literally like losing the rest of the world, right? They don't even notice when all the other boys are disappearing, becoming asses, right? Because they're so caught up in the pool hall and smoking and drinking with Lambden, right? Or Lampwick or whatever. Yeah. Lampwick? Oh, interesting. I didn't catch that in the name. I'll bet you there's something there too. So we, anyways, they're so self-absorbed that the world is falling apart literally around them, and they have no idea that it's happening, right? Not a really useful model for survivability in the world. If everybody were to do that, okay, what is left over afterwards, right? So that's why it's a heroic quality, is unselfishness, right? We're not getting so caught up in what we're doing that we're losing track of the rest of the world. Now, that's a distinction, though, from self-centeredness. Like, I am the center of my reality. I am the center of my universe. I am the ultimate authority in my world, right? The decision maker for me. And that's different. And I think that's something to be really like embodied and I think that exists in this too. I mean, it's his consciousness externalized. It's such a funny thing that they do in this story, right? But what we're ultimately trying to get him to do is be at the center of his own reality and be responsible for himself, to showing up in society the way that he wants to be, if he wants to be a real boy, right? And that is different. You can't do that without a sense of self-center.
Yeah.
Right? Without you being in the driver's seat.
Because it's like advocating for his awareness, that he be noticing. Whereas before, his dad bought this coat, he didn't even know that he was having kind of a selfish impact. And so, okay, cool. So like coming into these trials as a way to develop, what does it take to be in the kind of society that's going to survive?
Exactly.
We kind of take care of each other. We take note of the implications of our own actions.
Yeah, and I do think, going back to what we were talking about with Turning Red, that is the tension that we're in. That's the paradoxical tension that exists in these stories, is that we're dealing with, on the one hand, King Trident has a point. When society follows certain rules, we're all a lot safer, right? And on the other hand, when those rules get too rigid. Right? We don't have individuality, and then what's the point of all those rules anyway, right? So I think there's this tension between a social contract and an individual desire in the world and path in the world.
The way that I kind of think about these tensions is I like to think about it, I like to present it as like a calibration. So we come into the world, we take certain actions, and at some point it starts to just not work. And so then we have to correct, and maybe sometimes we go too far to the other side, and we go from ultimate selfishness to like ultimate selflessness. And I think that that's like an archetype, like a contemporary archetype of like the mom who gives her whole self to everyone in the world, and as a result can't actually sustain the caretaking because she isn't getting she's not filling her own cup up enough. And so kind of then coming back to some, like, how do we calibrate, find some sort of happy medium? And I love this idea of calibration because I think that it's constant. We're going to come into a world, calibrate, pendulate to the other side, and then maybe we'll find a happy medium, but then something in our world will change and we'll have to start, we don't have to do anything, but then we can choose to like calibrate again to find out, like, we're always searching for, like, where does it feel good in my world? Like, how do I make it workable?
Yeah, and what I think is really interesting and that we didn't talk about in this story is that a lot of times the seeds for what the next part of our journey is planted in the current iteration. Like the problems that we're having in the current iteration wind up becoming the strengths that we need to overcome the next iteration. So like when he becomes, he starts to turn into an ass, right? And he grows the long ears and he grows the long tail. And then in the next scene, he's got to get to the bottom of the ocean. And it's going to be a lot harder for him to do that if he doesn't have a tail to tie around a big rock, right? To fall down on the bottom of the ocean and walk along, dragging the rock along the bottom of the ocean. That's how he's trying to find Geppetto, right? And so it's like, it was that seed of ignorance that was planted that really was it was the impetus for his growth out of that last thing. Like it was him noticing, oh shit, I got like these long ears, that had him like check himself and get ready. But if he hadn't done that, he wouldn't have been prepared the same way for the next leg of his journey. Right. And so it's like, I love that because it's like this indication, this reminder to like honor the parts of the journey that you're in right now, even though they might seem like they're, despicable, or we don't nobody wants to turn into an ass. Right.
Man, I just love that idea of thinking about how is this happening for me? What could I possibly, like, how can this make me smarter, more prepared, and more equipped for whatever future endeavor? I love that idea of finding the benefits of the maybe strife and discomfort that I'm experiencing in the moment. I love that.
Totally. Yeah, I love it because it's a lens that's always available to us. We can always use whatever's happening to us in the moment, and we can just look at it and be like, hey, like a tarot card or something like that. How is this thing that's happening, quote unquote, to me, the thing that I'm dealing with that's a struggle in my life right now, how is it actually happening for me? Or what am I getting from this that I'm going to be a better human, better version of myself on the other side of it? So such a cool thing.
Yeah, totally.
What does this have?
Any concluding thoughts as we wrap up?
Just, I think, we're the tension between selfishness and society, don't be a little wooden head. Work on integrating your experiences to become the next version of yourself, and above all, listen to your conscience.
Listen to your conscience. I love that. Thanks for having such a lovely conversation about Pinocchio with me. This was really nice.
Yeah, thanks, wifey. See you next week, and in the meantime, live your freedom and love your life.